What's the deal, family? Welcome to my channel, Posse and OJ, where I discuss sports and trending sports topics. Today we're going to be talking about the modern NBA compared to the 90s NBA. So let's get right to it. The National Basketball Association today is a different brand of basketball than what we witnessed in the past years. It's a completely different game. Instead of a physical roughhouse game in the paint that led success to the big man, today's association allows perimeter players to run the floor. No other evidence is needed past a few highlights. NBA players today are more skillful, relevant to the 90s basketball ever been. NBA players were so much more physical back in the 90s, they had no handshake rule. A typical 90s NBA game was always a dogfight. Players were just more bigger, more physical, had more of an attitude back in the day. The 90s NBA game was always more exciting than today's NBA, my opinion. Today's NBA, I would consider it a big man league. Today's centers can dribble, shoot, and even pass. It's definitely a more complex game now than it's ever been. Take a lot of work for players to train and actually learn. Team defense is also miles ahead where it was in the 80s and 90s. The game recently changed, opening up for scoring players. The 90s still had defense that are more physical and more difficult to score on. I think today's NBA players train at a much more high intensive levels. Bodies became more different as the year progressed. In the 90s, the players were much mature coming out of high school. Today's NBA is a lot of jump shots, predominantly three-pointers. Fouls are called much more frequently. As far as trash talking, the 90s have the edge. Players like Ron Artest, Dennis Rodman, and Gary Payton all were super competitive on the court. More than half of the NBA's teams make the playoffs. Some of those squads are below average, like the Chicago Bulls, Sacramento Kings, just to name a few. This drawn-out cash grab is made all the more insufferable by today's NBA game, which requires the first round of the playoffs to be settled on the best-of-7 series. The official switch was made after the 2003 playoffs. The best-of-5 series was less tiresome in the first round. As far as the dunk contest, 90s had no chance. Players like Zach LaVine, Victor Oladipo all had highlight dunks. We don't mind seeing the same dunks, as long as they're done with grace and style. Back in the 90s, most players didn't have the athletic schism to do creative dunks. You had players like Vince Carter, Jason Richardson, and Tracy McGrady. Those were the three that stuck out to me the best. The 90s was a lot easier to enjoy the game, or a player for what it is. It isn't being thoroughly discussed. This stuff out the locker room, that's nearly impossible today. Every move a player makes today will be discussed through social media. You usually have to go to a game for fans' perspective. Now all you need is an internet connection. The 90s had the better coach matchups between Greg Popovich and Phil Jackson, just to name a few. Take a look at last year's NBA Finals. Eric Spoelstra against Frank Vogel. That was great. Coaches back then actually coached. It felt like a chess match throughout the game. As far as rivalries, there's none compared to the 90s NBA. You had the Lakers versus Bulls, Knicks versus Bulls. The only real one left today in the modern NBA is the Celtics and Lakers, and that's because they have a long history of facing off in the NBA Finals. The real question is, what are the rivalries in today's league? Lakers versus Clippers? No. Knicks versus Milwaukee? Nah. As far as the network, the game broadcast on All We Miss on NBA on NBC. All my 90 people will know about that. Being a fan in the 90s was epic back then. The tickets were way more affordable. Now tickets these days are through the roof. These days, NBA arenas cater to corporations and media. In my opinion, I don't think they are paying the customer into consideration as much. Everything is overly expensive. At the end of the day, it's about money and business. In the 90s, you needed 2 Hall of Famers to get to the promised land, in my opinion. In today's NBA, conferences are top heavy. I think the history of the game don't get much respect. Today's game is revolved around media. In the 90s, the paint was patrolled by Hall of Famers like Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, and David Robinson, and Shaquille O'Neal. Plus an all-star center in Dikembe Mutombo, Alonzo Mourning. So to sum it up, in my opinion, the NBA took a downfall in most aspects. Before press conferences and the media stories constantly, the NBA was all about basketball. I respect today's NBA and the players, but it will never be 90s NBA basketball. That's all I have for you for today. Stay safe out there, family. Till next time.
Question, she don't have no play. Leave that nigga at the scene, he ain't got no fade. Put that bitch up in her place, she ain't got no type of say. Hit a nigga in his shit.